Thank you very much, and welcome to the Asia Society. Our purpose here is simple. That is to act on climate and to act on sustainability. Not just a matter for governments, not just a matter for corporations, but a matter for individuals as well. Yesterday's Climate Action Summit, convened by the UN Secretary-General, goes to the heart of this agenda. And when we talk about the responsibilities of business, it's impressive that we've got 2,100 chambers of commerce signalling their intention to do more, and the Asset Owner Alliance, significantly covering more than 2.4 trillion, pledged to achieve carbon neutrality by their investments by 2050. That's significant, and I congratulate them for doing so. And on the question of sustainable investing, the point just made about the growing culture across the corporate world is a major hope for the future. I see it in companies around the world, large and small. I sit on the Sustainability Advisory Board of Morgan Stanley here in New York, where I now live and work and have my being. And whereas once, not too long ago, this was seen as exotic, it is exotic no longer. Of course, our challenge now is to take it down to absolute levels of reality, given the difficult and sometimes indifferent and often vacillating political and policy environment in which many corporations operate around the world. Which leads me to what I want to address in part today. I don't normally do this because I see myself as a global citizen, but I'm very mindful of the fact that on a day like this I also happen to be an Australian, hence why I speak the Queen's English in the manner in which I do. It is the Queen's English. I'm sorry to apologise to the Brits here present. And that is when the nations of the world gather at the UN Secretary-General's Climate Summit, it is an occasion for international reckoning as to what our various national governments are doing or not doing. And when I see what is happening here in the United States, I quietly weep. And when I see what is happening now in my own country, Australia, I do so as well. In our country, the scientific reports are clear. And when I look, for example, at our principal national scientific agency, the CSIRO, which indicates that our temperature in the last century has already increased on average by 1 degree centigrade per year. Furthermore, that very high monthly maximum temperatures that used to occur around 2% of the time are now occurring at 12% of the time. A decline of around 11% in our mid-year rainfall in southeastern Australia since the late 1990s, and a 20% decline in southwestern Australia over a similar period of time. And looking forward at the projections from the same scientific body, a body made up of essentially thousands of humorless scientists in white coats without a single political agenda among them. They just crunch data. By 2090, Melbourne is predicted to experience 24 days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, compared with 11 in 1995. Sydney will experience 11 such days in 2090, compared with just 3 in 1995. And our regional city in central Australia, Alice Springs, is projected to swelter through more than 83 days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit by 2090. The length of drought for our farmers will increase up to 20% over the same period, and naturally our wildfire season, what we call our bushfire season, will get longer and more dangerous. At the same time, Australia is projected to experience sea level rise of almost 3 feet by 2090, and if the Antarctic ice sheet collapses, this would be a foot higher again. And around Australia, we're a very large island, if you care to look at the map. There's 35,000 kilometres of coastal road and rail infrastructure at risk from sea level rise and storm surges, worth literally hundreds of billions of invested dollars. Leaving aside the cumulative impact of accelerated and accentuated natural disasters. Regrettably, however, under these circumstances, the current Australian government chose not to attend at prime ministerial level the Global Climate Summit convened yesterday here in New York. And so while Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish heroine in my view, was making her impassioned speech and lambasting the world's political leadership in very intemperate, but I think entirely appropriate teenage language, it would have been useful for the world's political leaders to hear what the next generation has to say. Regrettably, my own Prime Minister was not there to hear those remarks. And therefore, when I look at the record in recent years in Australia, we see emissions now rising since the change in government in Australia several years ago by 1% per year, as many of our previous climate change policy settings have been put to one side. We are now on track for an 8% increase in our emissions by 2030, unacceptable. Indeed, according to Endeavour Environmental, Australia's annual emissions to March this year hit 561 million tonnes, their highest ever. In other words, my own nation is moving in precisely the wrong direction. By contrast, the World Resources Institute projected in 2017 that almost 60 countries covering more than 60% of global emissions will peak their emissions by 2030, whereas we are seeking in Australia at present to grow them by 8% by 2030. This, in my judgment, is simply unacceptable. Therefore, the question for us all, and those of us who are in the business of the public policy space, is what then should be done? Of course, in countries like our own, and in countries like the United States and other democracies, including Canada, these are matters ultimately for political choice. We have acted with political choice and agency in the past. The government which I was proud to lead between 2007 and our government losing office in 2013, we enacted a mandatory renewable energy target, taking our renewable energy sector from just 4% of total electricity supply to 20% by 2020. And because that has not been repealed by our Conservative successors, that target has been virtually achieved. We legislated for an emissions trading scheme to put in place a price on carbon. The Conservatives defeated that in our Senate twice. We then brought in a carbon tax, which the Conservatives then repealed, having defeated us at the 2013 election. We subsidised solar panels to go on 1/5 of the entire nation's housing stock. We also funded insulation for heating and cooling purposes for low-income families for 1/5 of the nation's housing stock. And as a consequence, if you look at aggregate emissions in our period in office, bit by bit, they came down. This was, in fact, how it was supposed to be. But we now see the reverse trend in place. So the question which I as an Australian must address, given that our current Prime Minister has failed to address it, is what then should be done on the part of a G20 economy, Australia, one which represents one of the 20 largest emitters, therefore, in the world, and therefore carrying with it some responsibility, is what then should we do and how then should we lead? I would simply put out 5 concrete ideas. The first is, we, that is Australia, could have committed to undertake a proper review of our climate policy next year in line with both the spirit and the substance of the Paris Agreement. And as the UN Secretary-General has asked every country to do, we should have done the same. Number 2, as part of that review, we should have got rid of what we describe as the tricky accounting rules that allow for the carryover of unused Kyoto credits. For example, the Pacific Islands Development Forum, made up of our nearest neighbours, have recently issued a communique themselves decrying this unacceptable behaviour in seeking to artificially mask non-climate change performance with an accounting mechanism from a different period of international action. Third, we, in New York, could have laid out a timeline for us to deliver a long-term decarbonisation strategy, as the Paris Agreement invites us to do. Indeed, the current Australian government promised this at the most recent G20 and at the Pacific Islands Forum, and to do so by next year. Fourth, we could have committed to developing a long-term plan for a net zero target for 2050 and to work back from there. The United Kingdom has done this. The New Zealand government has done this. More than 60 other countries around the world have done this, as well as over 100 cities and over 90 large corporations worldwide. In fact, as of last month, every single Australian state within the Australian Federation has now committed to being net zero by 2050. Therefore, I ask why it's not reasonable for our national government to do the same. And fifth, we, that is Australia, could have followed the lead of the United Kingdom, France and others in bringing funds to the table to help with the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund, something I had a lot to do with the establishment of back in 2009. Rather than simply rebadging old money to pretend it's new, or to set up national funds to provide support for this, when in fact it's far better for governments around the world to approach a single global fund. The sad fact is, Australia in the most recent few days has chosen to do none of these things. They are 5 simple recommendations which could easily have been implemented and provided a framework for future action. Instead, we find Australia continuing to bury its head in the sand while our farmers find it increasingly difficult to deal with our natural environment through drought, flood, and natural disasters of an intensity and duration we have not seen in our federated history. A Great Barrier Reef, one of the natural wonders of the world, bleaching away into non-existence. And, of course, increasingly violent and unseasonal bushfires and floods taking human lives. On climate, I fear we in Australia have become the complacent country. But being the complacent country has real consequences, both for our environment, our people, and for our economy. And of course, the challenge for us is now to plan ahead to change course. As I said, I normally speak in these environments, given I live in New York and work in the world, as a global citizen. But there are times, even as a global citizen, you're called back to questions of national responsibility and think, why is it that we have failed to act when in fact our national circumstances should command us to act? Governments, as I said at the outset, represent one large slice of action. And in the absence of national legislative frameworks, in the absence of regulatory frameworks, and in the absence of international treaty arrangements such as the Paris Agreement, then it is often hard to see how corporations and individuals mobilise. Therefore, what government does matters. But the single most encouraging thing in global climate change action has been the rolling mobilisation and consciousness changing of the corporate world. This, for me, is the great source of optimism for the future. If we can continue to see corporates mobilising in the way in which they have in New York in the course of the last 36 hours, the international chambers of commerce, as well as those representing significant quantums of funds under management, we begin, therefore, to make measurable progress. Of course, translating this through into day-to-day investment activity by large institutional investors is a hard business. And sitting on one very large financial institution's sustainability advisory board, I understand the praxis of that at a level of granularity. But we are moving in a particular direction, and in a positive direction. And I see with corporate America that being a source for optimism, just as I look at Washington and the state of our national politics here in this country as moving precisely in the reverse direction. Therefore, in a gathering such as this, we should note where governments have failed, where our governments are succeeding, but note also where there is positive news and optimism to be had from what corporates are doing as well. But let us never forget that in these circumstances, it's important too to recognise the importance, the centrality of an occasional prophetic and discomforting voice. And I conclude where I began, talking about young Greta. There is a young woman with attitude, serious attitude, the sort of attitude I'd admire and occasionally cringe with my own daughter. But invariably she was right, and pointing out double standards and hypocrisy when she saw it, and creating a moral challenge for the generation ahead of her given that this world is for her generation to take responsibility for in the future. So for all those who thought that young Greta might have gone too far and have been too angry in such an august gathering of largely men yesterday, middle-aged men at that, some older than that, I'd just say to those blokes, those guys, those men, get used to it. Welcome to the future. I thank you.